The Thule Society was right.
Look here, the pattern matches the glow precisely.
We have found it.
The shapes are activating. Reroute power to the seismic dampeners.
History often survives not as a clean record of truth, but as a battlefield of silence, redaction, and deliberate omission, where the most sensitive events are buried beneath classification stamps and blacked-out pages. And it is within these gaps that legends are born. Among the most enduring of these legends is the claim that in the frozen wastelands of Antarctica, something was discovered that was never meant to be seen. Something so destabilizing that governments chose secrecy over disclosure. And the story begins not with flying saucers or hidden civilizations, but with the nature of war itself, because wartime operations thrive on deception, misdirection, and plausible deniability. And when militaries move massive fleets under the banner of training exercises, history teaches us to look closer, not farther away. As Antarctica in the mid-20th century represented both the last untouched frontier and the perfect place to hide something extraordinary, a continent so hostile and remote that even today it remains largely unexplored. And in 1947, it was a white void on the map, a place where mistakes could vanish and discoveries could be locked away forever. And it was into this void that one of the largest military expeditions in human history was sent, officially tasked with cold weather training and aerial surveys, yet unofficially rumored to have encountered something that rewrote the boundaries of reality itself. To understand why such speculation persists, one must first understand the psychological climate of the era, because the world had just emerged from the most destructive war ever fought. Nuclear fire had fallen from the sky, and humanity had crossed a threshold it could never return from. And in the aftermath, fear became a currency as valuable as oil or steel. Fear of secret weapons, fear of hidden enemies, fear that somewhere beyond the reach of radar and reconnaissance, forces were preparing for the next war before the ashes of the last had even cooled. And Antarctica, with its endless ice sheets and subterranean mysteries, became the perfect canvas for these anxieties. Rumors spread quietly at first, whispered among veterans and intelligence circles, that German forces had not fully surrendered, that advanced technologies had disappeared along with high-ranking officials, that submarines slipped beneath the southern seas carrying more than fleeing men, and that beneath the Antarctic ice there existed not just a refuge, but a stronghold, shielded from detection and armed with technologies the modern world could not yet comprehend. And while such ideas sound fantastical, they gained traction because they intersected with documented facts. Nazi Germany had indeed pursued secret research programs, occult ideologies, and experimental aircraft. And the United States Navy did indeed deploy a massive task force to Antarctica barely a year after the war's end, led by an admiral whose career was inseparably tied to polar exploration. And when that expedition ended abruptly, months ahead of schedule, questions began to surface that no official report fully answered. Why withdraw such an enormous force so suddenly? Why issue ambiguous warnings about future wars fought over the poles? And why did certain testimonies, interviews, and alleged documents hint at encounters that defied conventional explanation? Because history does not require proof to generate belief, only coincidence layered upon silence. And as decades passed, the story evolved, absorbing fragments of real expeditions, Cold War paranoia, declassified intelligence reports, and ancient myths into a single narrative that refused to die, a narrative claiming that beneath the frozen crust of the Earth lay a hidden world, populated by an advanced civilization that had watched humanity from the shadows, intervening only when atomic weapons threatened the balance of the planet. And whether this hidden world was myth, metaphor, or misunderstood reality, the question remains the same. Why has Antarctica, more than any other place on Earth, become the focal point for stories of secret wars, lost civilizations, and forbidden knowledge? And why do these stories always circle back to one moment in time, one expedition, and one warning that seemed to echo far beyond the ice? Because in war, the greatest truths are rarely written in ink. They are written in absence, in what is not said, not shown, and not explained. And as we move deeper into this story, beyond official histories and comfortable explanations, the fog thickens, forcing us to confront a disturbing possibility that the most dangerous discoveries are not the ones we fail to find, but the ones we find and choose to hide. Antarctica is not merely a place on the map, but an environment so extreme that it actively resists human presence. A vast polar desert stretching over 5.5 million square miles, where survival itself feels like a violation of natural law. And long before conspiracy theories ever took root, the continent had already earned a reputation as a graveyard for ambition, with winds powerful enough to tear steel apart and temperatures capable of flash freezing exposed flesh within minutes, creating a landscape where even sound seems to die beneath the ice. And yet it was precisely this hostility that made Antarctica irresistible to explorers, empires, and eventually militaries, because untouched land represents possibility, and possibility has always attracted those seeking power, resources, or strategic advantage. And by the early 19th century, the southernmost continent had become the final frontier of human exploration, drawing expeditions from Britain, France, Norway, Belgium, Sweden, Japan, and the United States, each driven by scientific curiosity on the surface and national prestige beneath it, as flags were planted, coastlines charted, and temporary outposts established, not as claims of ownership, but as quiet declarations of presence in a world where presence itself was influence. Despite its barrenness, Antarctica promised untapped resources, from mineral wealth to rich whaling grounds, and a nation capable of mastering its environment would gain not only economic leverage, but symbolic dominance over the last unknown region of Earth. And nowhere was this potential exploited more efficiently than by Norway, whose whaling fleets operated with ruthless precision from Antarctic coastal bases, extracting oil and fat essential to industrial economies, a success that did not go unnoticed by other powers watching from afar. By the late 1930s, as Europe teetered toward war, Antarctica's strategic value began to shift from exploration to survival. Because modern warfare consumes resources at an unprecedented rate, and any nation cut off from global trade would quickly find itself crippled, and this reality weighed heavily on the leadership of Nazi Germany, who understood that once hostilities began, imports of vital oils and fats would vanish almost overnight, threatening both military operations and civilian morale. And so attention turned southward, toward the frozen seas where whales still swam in abundance, and toward continent, officially considered neutral, remote, and beyond immediate scrutiny. Under the cover of economic necessity, a German expedition was organized, presented to the world as a scientific and commercial mission, yet structured with military discipline and secrecy, raising questions that would linger long after the snow settled over their tracks. Because this was not a casual voyage of explorers, but a carefully planned operation led by a decorated naval officer and supported by advanced reconnaissance aircraft, suggesting objectives that extended beyond whaling alone. When a German ship reached the Antarctic coastline and its crews began surveying the land from the air, they were not merely mapping ice and mountains, but asserting presence, dropping flags into the snow from above, marking territory in a way no previous expedition had attempted, and naming it as their own, a symbolic act that echoed the expansionist ideology driving Germany at the time. And though official, Records state that the mission failed to establish a permanent base and returned home within weeks. The brevity of the expedition only fueled suspicion, because nothing about the scale of preparation suggested such a limited outcome. And war has taught us that when official explanations are simple, the truth is often complex. Antarctica's geography itself encourages such speculation, because beneath its miles-thick ice sheets lie mountains, lakes, and cave systems shielded from satellites. Surface observation, environments that modern science is only now beginning to understand. In the 1930s, these hidden features were completely unknown, allowing imagination to fill the gaps where data could not reach. And when coupled with the continent's isolation, it becomes clear why Antarctica would later serve as the perfect stage for legends of hidden fortresses, secret technologies, and subterranean worlds. Because if something extraordinary were discovered there, it could remain concealed indefinitely, buried under ice and silence alike. And as the world descended into total war, Antarctica slipped once more into obscurity, its secrets frozen in time, waiting for the moment when humanity would return, not as explorers, but as soldiers, carrying with them the fears and unresolved questions of a world forever changed by conflict. To understand why Antarctica later became entangled with whispers of secret bases and impossible technologies, one must first understand the mindset of the Nazi regime itself, because the Third Reich was not driven solely by military pragmatism or political ideology, but by a dangerous fusion of mythology, pseudoscience, and obsession with hidden power. A worldview in which history was not something to be studied, but something to be rewritten to validate supremacy. And at the heart of this belief system was the conviction that an ancient master race had once ruled the world, a race whose knowledge and technology had been lost to time, waiting to be rediscovered by those deemed worthy. And Adolf Hitler, along with several high-ranking members of the Nazi hierarchy, fully embraced this idea, believing that modern Germans were the descendants of this primordial civilization, and that proof of this lineage could be uncovered through archaeology, anthropology, and esoteric research, leading the regime to pour enormous resources into projects that the outside world dismissed as fantasy, but which the Nazis treated as strategic imperatives. This obsession gave rise to organizations dedicated entirely to uncovering ancient secrets, most notably the Antener, an institute tasked with blending science and mysticism in the pursuit of ideological validation, sending expeditions across the globe to Tibet, South America, the Middle East, and the Arctic, searching for relics lost, knowledge, and evidence of forgotten civilizations. And within this framework, Antarctica held particular allure, not merely as an unexplored continent, but as a place that existed beyond conventional history, untouched by recorded civilization, and therefore untainted by narratives that contradicted Nazi mythology, making it the perfect location to search for origins, entrances, or truths hidden from the modern world. Intertwined with this belief in an ancient race was the concept of the Hollow Earth, a theory that had circulated in European intellectual circles for centuries and proposed that the planet was not solid but layered, with vast inner spaces capable of supporting life. And while mainstream science rejected the idea, it resonated deeply with Nazi thinkers who saw in it the possibility of a hidden world preserved from degeneration, a sanctuary where the ancestors of the Aryans might still exist, or where their lost technologies could be recovered. And according to certain interpretations, the polar regions were not just frozen wastelands, but gateways concealed beneath ice and snow, leading to the inner realms of the Earth. This is where Antarctica transformed from a resource target into something far more symbolic. Because if an entrance to such a realm existed anywhere, it would be at the poles, shielded from casual discovery and guarded by nature itself. And under this lens, the German expedition of 1938 appears less like a failed whaling venture and more like reconnaissance, a preliminary survey designed to map terrain, test access routes, and identify anomalies hidden beneath the ice, all while maintaining plausible deniability should questions arise. And when the expedition abruptly returned home, The official explanation of failure did little to extinguish speculation, because secrecy breeds curiosity, and curiosity hardens into belief when paired with the known eccentricities of those in power. As the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated, rumors began to circulate that advanced projects were being relocated away from bombed cities and into inaccessible regions, that prototype aircraft and experimental technologies were being hidden or transported to locations beyond Allied reach, and that Antarctica, unreachable by conventional invasion and largely ignored by wartime surveillance, offered the perfect refuge. And though no concrete evidence supports these claims, the disappearance of certain personnel and research programs toward the war's end ensured that the rumors never fully died, because history rarely provides neat conclusions when chaos reigns. And by the time Berlin fell, the idea that the Nazis had uncovered something extraordinary beneath the ice had already taken hold in the collective imagination, laying the groundwork for what would come next. Because when the war ended and the world exhaled in relief, attention quietly shifted southward once more, toward a continent that had seen no battles, dropped no bombs, and yet seemed destined to become the setting for the war's strangest and most persistent mystery. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe on May 7, 1945, and Nazi Germany signed its unconditional surrender, the world was told that the Third Reich had been crushed completely, its leadership dismantled, its armies scattered, and its ambitions buried beneath the rubble of ruined cities. Yet history rarely ends so cleanly, especially when an empire collapses under the weight of secrets. And in the chaotic aftermath of defeat, while millions of soldiers marched into captivity, a quieter and far more unsettling movement began to unfold beneath the surface of official victory, as select members of the Nazi hierarchy vanished without trace, slipping through the tightening Allied net via clandestine escape routes that would later become known as Ratlins, an intricate web of smugglers, sympathetic officials, forged documents, and hidden transport corridors that funneled fugitives out of Europe and toward distant shores, particularly South America, where geography, politics, and corruption offered the anonymity they desperately needed. Submarines played a central role in this shadow exodus, as German U-boats, once the terror of the Atlantic, were repurposed into vessels of escape, carrying cargoes that officially did not exist and passengers whose names never appeared on surrender rolls. And it was the sudden appearance of these submarines months after the war's end that reignited global suspicion, beginning with the arrival of U-530 at the Argentine naval base of Mar del Plata in July 1945, long after Germany had supposedly ceased all operations, its crew offering vague explanations for their delayed surrender and fueling rumors that their voyage included detours far to the south, toward waters few nations actively monitored. The situation escalated when a second submarine, U-977, arrived weeks later, reinforcing the belief that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger, coordinated effort, and in the absence of transparent explanations, speculation rushed in to fill the void, with claims ranging from the transport of looted treasures and secret technologies to the escape of high-ranking officials, including Adolf Hitler himself, whose death in Berlin, though officially confirmed, remained fertile ground for doubt in the minds of those unwilling to accept such a mundane into a figure who had reshaped the world through terror. Journalists, authors, and self-proclaimed witnesses began publishing explosive accounts alleging that the Nazi leadership had retreated to hidden sanctuaries beyond the reach of Allied justice. And among the most provocative of these claims was the idea that Antarctica served as a final redoubt, a frozen vault where the remnants of the regime could regroup, preserve their ideology, and wait for a future moment to re-emerge, protected by distance, climate, and secrecy. These stories were dismissed by many as post-war hysteria, yet they persisted precisely because they intersected with verifiable anomalies, unexplained submarine movements, missing personnel, and the known existence of advanced German research projects that had never been fully accounted for. And as the Cold War dawned and former enemies became uneasy allies, certain questions were quietly set aside in favor of new geopolitical priorities, allowing unresolved mysteries to calcify into legend. It was within this atmosphere of uncertainty that a striking quote began circulating, attributed to Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the German Navy, claiming pride in the construction of an impregnable fortress in a distant land, a Shangri-La beyond the reach of enemies. And whether the quote was misattributed, exaggerated, or fabricated entirely mattered less than the effect it had, because it provided a narrative anchor, a suggestion that somewhere something had been built and deliberately concealed. And if such a refuge did exist, Antarctica, with its impenetrable ice and absence of civilian oversight, seemed the only logical location. By the time the United States and its allies began to piece together the post-war balance of power, the idea that a defeated enemy might still possess hidden capabilities was no longer paranoia, but strategic concern, because the war had proven that underestimating secret programs could be catastrophic, and so attention once again drifted south, toward the last place on Earth where ghosts of a fallen empire might still linger beneath the ice, waiting to be discovered or destroyed. In the summer of 1946, barely a year after the end of the most devastating war in human history, the United States Navy launched one of the largest Antarctic expeditions ever assembled, a massive operation officially described as a cold-weather training exercise, but structured with a scale and urgency that immediately raised eyebrows. Because Operation Highjump was not a modest scientific mission, but a full-fledged military deployment, involving more than 4,700 personnel, 13 ships, multiple aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, and an air wing equipped with reconnaissance planes designed for long-range surveillance, all under the command of Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, a decorated naval officer and polar explorer whose reputation lent credibility to the mission while simultaneously adding an air of mystery. As Byrd was not merely a soldier, but a man deeply familiar with the polar extremes and the unknowns they concealed, the official objectives were straightforward. On paper, to test equipment in extreme cold, establish a temporary research base, and expand America's presence in Antarctica during a rapidly shifting post-war landscape. Yet the sheer speed with which the operation was organized, along with the overwhelming military resources committed to it, suggested that something more pressing lay beneath the surface, especially considering that Antarctica posed no immediate conventional threat to the United States, and the idea of training thousands of troops in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth seemed disproportionate and less driven by intelligence concerns that were not being publicly disclosed. Rumors circulated even before the fleet departed, fueled by classified briefings and whispers among naval circles that Operation Highjump was intended to investigate anomalies detected during wartime reconnaissance, or to locate remnants of enemy activity believed to be hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. And while no official documents confirmed these suspicions, the geopolitical climate of the time made them plausible, as American strategists were acutely aware that Germany's technological advancements had often outpaced Allied expectations during the war, and the possibility that experimental projects had been relocated to remote regions could not be dismissed outright. Once the task force reached Antarctic waters, conditions quickly proved more challenging than anticipated, with violent storms, shifting ice packs, and unpredictable weather patterns disrupting flight operations and supply routes. Yet despite these hazards, the expedition pressed forward, establishing Little America for and conducting extensive aerial surveys that mapped vast stretches of previously uncharted terrain. And it was during these flights that reports emerged of equipment failures, unexplained crashes, and encounters that were either downplayed or omitted entirely from public summaries. Incidents that later became the cornerstone of speculation surrounding the operation. What intensified the mystery, however, was the abrupt and premature termination of Operation Highjump, as the expedition was scheduled to last 6 months but was recalled after only 8 weeks, a decision officially attributed to worsening weather conditions. Yet veterans of polar exploration knew that Antarctic weather was always severe and rarely served as sufficient reason to abandon a mission of such magnitude without attempting to regroup or Adjust objectives. Adding fuel to the fire were statements attributed to Admiral Byrd following his return, particularly remarks made during interviews in which he warned that future wars could be fought by aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds, a comment that, while vague, implied the existence or anticipation of advanced aerial technology operating in polar regions. And although these statements were later contextualized as strategic speculation, they resonated deeply with those already convinced that Operation Highjump had encountered something unexpected. In the years that followed, the U.S. Navy released sanitized reports emphasizing scientific achievements and logistical lessons learned. But gaps remained, questions that were never fully answered, and when viewed in combination with post-war submarine sightings, missing German assets, and the sudden militarization of Antarctic exploration, Operation Highjump became less a footnote in polar history and more a focal point for theories suggesting that the frozen continent was not merely a training ground, but a stage for a quiet confrontation, one that ended not in victory or defeat, but in silence, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions buried beneath miles of ice, waiting for someone brave or reckless enough to dig deeper. As Operation Highjump pushed deeper into the Antarctic interior, the mission quietly crossed an invisible boundary between conventional military exploration and something far more unsettling. Because beyond the mapped coastlines and predictable hazards of ice and wind lay a landscape that behaved in ways seasoned pilots and navigators struggled to explain. And it was during this phase that a series of incidents began to circulate among crew members, stories exchanged in hushed tones and later dismissed in official debriefings, yet consistent enough in their details to resist complete erasure, beginning with reconnaissance flights that reported vast ice-free zones appearing where none should exist, stretches of exposed rock and liquid water surrounded by frozen wilderness, anomalies that contradicted everything known about the region's climate and geology. And while modern science now acknowledges the existence of Antarctic dry valleys, at the time these sightings were deeply confusing, particularly when combined with reports of unusual thermal readings detected by onboard instruments. Readings that suggested heat sources beneath the ice far more intense than could be explained by geothermal activity alone. Pilots described sudden turbulence and electromagnetic interference that caused compasses to spin and radios to fail, forcing emergency landings or abrupt course changes. And in at least one widely circulated account, an aircraft failed to return from a routine survey flight, its disappearance officially attributed to weather and navigational error. Though some crew members later claimed the conditions had been unusually calm, fueling speculation that the loss was not accidental but the result of an encounter that could not be acknowledged. What truly propelled Operation Highjump into legend, however, were the stories of unidentified aerial objects observed moving at extraordinary speeds, craft described as disc-shaped or crescent-like, capable of maneuvering effortlessly through both air and extreme cold, outpacing the fastest aircraft of the era without visible propulsion. And according to these accounts, the objects appear to rise from the ice or skim just above the surface of the water before vanishing into the sky, leaving behind stunned observers and a profound sense of vulnerability. Because whatever these craft were, they operated with a technological superiority that rendered conventional defenses irrelevant. Skeptics later argued that such sightings were the result of optical illusions, experimental American aircraft, or the stress-induced misinterpretations of exhausted personnel. Yet the consistency of descriptions across separate crews lent the stories a persistence that refused to fade, especially when paired with post-war rumors of advanced German designs, such as the so-called flying discs and anti-gravity concepts allegedly explored in the final years of the Third Reich. The idea that remnants of Nazi technology had not only survived the war, but evolved in isolation beneath the Antarctic ice was both terrifying and intoxicating, suggesting a hidden continuity between wartime secrecy and post-war mystery. And it was within this narrative that Operation Highjump's sudden termination took on a darker tone. No longer a logistical decision, but a strategic withdrawal from an environment that had proven hostile in ways no training manual could prepare for. official silence followed, punctuated only by carefully worded statements emphasizing scientific data collection and cold weather experience, while any mention of encounters or anomalies was conspicuously absent. Yet among veterans, the stories endured, passed down as cautionary tales of a mission that ventured too far into territory it did not understand, and decades later, as declassified documents, interviews, and speculative research began to surface, these accounts were woven together into a broader tapestry of Antarctic lore, one that blurred the line between military history and the unexplained, leaving a haunting question in its wake: whether Operation Highjump had stumbled upon remnants of a defeated enemy, evidence of an unknown civilization, or something entirely beyond human origin, and if so, whether the greatest discovery of the 20th century had been deliberately buried beneath ice and secrecy, not because it lacked credibility, but because the world was not ready for what lay hidden at the bottom of the planet. By the time stories from Operation Highjump began filtering into the public consciousness, they collided with theories that had existed on the fringes of science for centuries, breathing new life into ideas that many believed had been permanently discredited. Chief among them, the hollow Earth hypothesis, a concept proposing that the planet was not a solid sphere, but a layered structure containing vast inner spaces, complete with their own ecosystems, light sources, and possibly intelligent life. And while the theory had long been rejected by mainstream geology, it persisted in occult circles, speculative literature, and, most intriguingly, in documents and ideologies associated with the Nazi regime, which had viewed the idea not as fantasy, but as an explanation for ancient myths and unexplained phenomena scattered across human history. Proponents of the theory argued that polar regions were not merely geographic extremes, but natural gateways, areas where the Earth's crust thinned or curved inward, concealing entrances beneath ice, storms, and magnetic distortions, and Antarctica, with its vast unexplored interior and extreme conditions, became the ultimate candidate for such an opening, a place where conventional exploration was hindered and where anomalies could remain hidden indefinitely. When reports from Highjump described ice-free zones, unusual heat signatures, and electromagnetic interference, believers saw confirmation rather than coincidence, interpreting these details as surface effects of a warmer, technologically advanced world below, one shielded from surface catastrophes and preserved in a state of stability unknown to modern civilization. Within this framework, the idea of Nazi survival beneath the ice took on a new dimension, because instead of merely hiding on the surface, remnants of the Third Reich were imagined to have gained access to this inner realm, either through ancient knowledge, recovered technology, or sheer desperation, forming an uneasy alliance with forces far beyond human understanding. And according to some narratives, this alliance allowed them to continue developing advanced craft, explaining the extraordinary performance of the unidentified objects reportedly encountered during Operation Highjump. Ancient texts and global myths were retroactively woven into this interpretation, from stories of Agartha and Shambhala in Eastern traditions to subterranean gods and underworlds described in Greek and Mesoamerican lore, all reframed as fragmented memories of contact with an inner world that periodically interacted with the surface, retreating whenever human aggression or environmental collapse threatened its stability. Critics dismissed these connections as pattern-seeking imagination, yet the persistence of similar themes across cultures and eras made complete dismissal difficult, because while the details differed, the core idea remained consistent: that beneath the Earth's surface lay a hidden domain, inaccessible to most, but capable of influencing surface events when necessary. During the Cold War, these theories quietly intersected with legitimate scientific curiosity about Earth's interior, magnetic fields, and geothermal activity, creating a gray zone where speculation thrived alongside research and governments, aware of how quickly rumors could spiral into panic or ideological exploitation, adopted a strategy of silence, neither confirming nor aggressively debunking claims related to Antarctic anomalies, a posture that paradoxically strengthened belief rather than weakening it. Over time, the Hollow Earth narrative evolved from a fringe idea into a cultural lens through which Antarctic mysteries were interpreted, shaping books, documentaries, and whispered conversations among researchers and enthusiasts alike. And whether viewed as a literal truth or a symbolic expression of humanity's fear of the unknown, the theory provided a framework that connected disparate threads: Nazi obsession, polar expeditions, unexplained encounters, and ancient myths into a single unsettling question: whether Antarctica was not the end of the world, but the entrance to another, one deliberately hidden from history, waiting in silence as humanity continued its restless search for answers on the surface above. In the years following Operation Highjump, Antarctica underwent a transformation that was subtle on the surface yet profound in its implications, shifting from a remote frontier of exploration into a carefully regulated zone of international cooperation. And it was this transition that fueled suspicions that something more than scientific curiosity was driving global policy. Because in 1959, at the height of the Cold War, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, an unprecedented agreement that designated the entire continent as a demilitarized zone reserved exclusively for peaceful research, effectively freezing territorial claims and banning nuclear testing, weapons deployment, and large-scale military activity, a move publicly celebrated as a triumph of diplomacy, but privately questioned by those who wondered why the most strategically isolated landmass on Earth required such sweeping restrictions. To supporters of Antarctic secrecy theories, the treaty appeared less like an act of idealism and more like a containment strategy, a collective decision by rival superpowers to keep certain discoveries buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Because if Antarctica truly held anomalies, advanced technologies, or access points to unknown realms, unrestricted competition would risk exposure, conflict, or worse, escalation beyond human control. The structure of the treaty reinforced these suspicions, granting inspection rights that were rarely exercised with transparency and establishing a framework in which research stations could operate under the guise of science while remaining shielded from public scrutiny. And although dozens of bases were eventually constructed across the continent, much of the interior remained off-limits, accessible only to select expeditions with government backing and security clearance, ensuring that the most remote regions stayed remote in practice as well as name. Reports from scientists and support staff who rotated through Antarctic stations occasionally hinted at unusual experiences, unexplained equipment malfunctions, restricted zones marked on maps without explanation, and instructions not to stray beyond certain coordinates. Yet these accounts rarely gained traction, dismissed as exaggerations born of isolation or the psychological strain of months spent in darkness and cold. And when individuals attempted to publish more explicit claims, they often found themselves marginalized, their credibility questioned, and their careers quietly derailed, reinforcing the perception that Antarctica was not just protected by ice, but by policy. During this period, technological advancements in satellite imagery and remote sensing paradoxically deepened the mystery rather than resolving it, as publicly available images were frequently low-resolution or selectively released, while certain areas appeared blurred, outdated, or inconsistently documented, fueling speculation that censorship extended beyond the ground and into orbit. And although official explanations cited technical limitations and environmental challenges, the pattern was enough to convince many that a line had been drawn around the continent, one that curiosity was discouraged from crossing. As decades passed, the narrative surrounding Antarctica shifted decisively, becoming framed almost exclusively as a pristine wilderness threatened by climate change, a symbol of fragile global balance. And while these concerns were legitimate, critics argued that they also served a convenient purpose, redirecting attention away from geopolitical and anomalous questions toward environmental stewardship, an issue few were willing to challenge openly. And so the ice remained undisturbed, not just physically but conceptually, preserved as a place where inquiry stopped at the edge of what was officially acknowledged. By the dawn of the 21st century, Antarctica had become one of the most tightly controlled regions on the planet, paradoxically. Open to international cooperation, yet inaccessible to independent verification. And in this controlled silence, the legend surrounding the continent only grew stronger, because history shows that when information is restricted, imagination expands to fill the gaps. And whether the treaty was a noble effort to prevent conflict or a quiet agreement to guard a secret too destabilizing to reveal, its existence ensured that whatever lay beneath the ice would remain there, unseen, unchallenged, and officially unexplained, at least for now. As the 21st century unfolded and technology advanced at a pace unmatched in human history, Antarctica began to reveal subtle inconsistencies that challenged the carefully maintained narrative of a continent fully understood and benignly governed. Because while official reports emphasized melting ice shelves, climate data, and ecological research, independent analysts, researchers, and amateur observers noticed patterns that did not align neatly with environmental explanations alone, beginning with satellite anomalies that appeared intermittently across publicly available imagery, vast geometric shapes beneath the ice, symmetrical formations too precise to be dismissed as natural fractures, and heat signatures that flared and vanished without correlation to volcanic activity or seasonal change, anomalies that were often corrected, blurred, or removed in subsequent image updates, leaving behind digital ghosts that only screenshots and archived data preserved. Advances in ice, penetrating radar, deployed for legitimate glaciological studies, added another layer of intrigue, as some scans revealed cavernous voids beneath miles of ice, spaces far larger than expected subglacial lakes, their boundaries sharply defined, suggesting structural stability rather than random erosion. And while mainstream science explained these features as rare but natural formations, the scale and regularity of certain detections reignited dormant theories about hidden infrastructure or access routes buried deep below the surface. At the same time, an increasing number of governments quietly expanded their Antarctic presence, upgrading research stations with runways capable of handling heavy aircraft, improving logistics far beyond what was necessary for seasonal science, and investing in long-term habitation technologies. Moves that seemed contradictory to the idea of Antarctica as a passive research zone. And when questioned, officials pointed to climate urgency and international collaboration, explanations that satisfied most but not all, particularly those who tracked defense budgets and noted overlaps between scientific funding and military research allocations. Whistleblowers, operating largely in the shadows of online forums and encrypted communication channels, claimed that certain Antarctic projects were compartmentalized to an extreme degree, with personnel rotated frequently and denied access to full mission scopes, a strategy consistent with secrecy rather than open research. And although such claims were impossible to verify conclusively, their details often aligned with observable facts, restricted airspace, limited civilian access, and logistical patterns that suggested ongoing operations of unknown purpose. Popular culture also played an unexpected role in reopening the Antarctic question, as documentaries, podcasts, and independent filmmakers began revisiting Operation Highjump, Nazi polar expeditions, and Hollow Earth. Theories, not as fringe curiosities, but as unresolved historical threads, introducing a new generation to ideas their predecessors had dismissed or forgotten. In an era defined by information abundance and institutional skepticism, these narratives found fertile ground, spreading rapidly and evolving through collective analysis rather than centralized authority. Perhaps most telling was the shift in tone from outright denial to strategic ambiguity, as official responses to inquiries about Antarctic anomalies increasingly relied on non-answers, deferrals, or appeals to complexity, a subtle change that suggested not ignorance, but caution. And for those watching closely, this caution was interpreted as confirmation that something remained unresolved beneath the ice. By the late 2010s and early 2020s, Antarctica had become a paradox, more mapped and monitored than ever before, yet simultaneously more mysterious. its surface cataloged in detail, while its depths remained largely off limits to independent verification. And as climate change accelerated ice loss in certain regions, exposing landscapes unseen for millions of years, anticipation grew that whatever had been hidden, intentionally or not, might soon be revealed by nature itself, forcing a reckoning between official narratives and the persistent belief that Antarctica was never just a continent, but a vault, one now beginning to show fractures, not only in its ice, but in the story humanity had been told about. What lay beneath? By the mid-2020s, Antarctica had transformed from a remote, icy wilderness into the planet's most scrutinized yet enigmatic frontier, a land governed by treaties, monitored by satellites, and patrolled by international research teams. Yet beneath this veneer of scientific cooperation, whispers of hidden anomalies, secret bases, and unexplored subterranean realms persisted, fueled by decades of rumor, historical expeditions, and unexplained phenomena. Because while official narratives framed the continent as a pristine laboratory for climate and glaciological studies, persistent anomalies suggested a far deeper story, starting with subglacial voids and cavern systems detected via advanced ice-penetrating radar that appeared unnaturally regular, forming networks too extensive to be dismissed as geological happenstance. These voids, in some reports, contain geometric structures, metallic signatures, and heat patterns inconsistent with natural activity, leading conspiracy theorists and independent explorers to speculate that remnants of Nazi expeditions, secret military installations, or even lost civilizations lay hidden beneath miles of ice. While mainstream science cautioned that extreme pressure, geothermal activity, and ice dynamics could explain most of the findings, a rebuttal that only added to public fascination and fueled speculation that governments were intentionally concealing truths too sensitive to reveal. Meanwhile, declassified documents and archival research revealed that the Cold War had left Antarctica far from neutral ground, with multiple nations running covert operations disguised as scientific missions, and evidence suggested that restricted airspaces, unusually fortified research stations, and highly compartmentalized personnel rotations were consistent with secrecy protocols rather than mere research logistics, feeding the belief that the continent's official openness masked carefully controlled zones where advanced technologies, experimental vehicles, or sensitive materials were stored and tested. Popular media amplified these ideas, drawing connections between historical expeditions like the 1938 Nazi Antarctic mission, Operation Highjump of 1946 to 1947, and sightings of unexplained aerial phenomena, suggesting a continuum of activity that spanned decades, from occult-driven exploration to Cold War militarization and modern scientific surveillance. And although skeptics dismissed much of this as coincidence or myth-making, the persistent patterns of secrecy, unexplained anomalies, and compartmentalized information created a compelling narrative of a hidden world lying just beneath the surface. Indigenous oral histories and mythologies, too, were woven into the story, with tales of subterranean realms, colossal creatures, and lost civilizations adding layers of cultural resonance to scientific and military speculation, implying that the fascination with hidden worlds beneath Antarctica was not merely modern paranoia, but part of a human tradition of imagining what lies beneath, a theme recurring in myth from Greek underworlds to Hindu subterranean cities. As satellite imagery improved and climate change slowly exposed new ice-free regions, access to previously hidden landscapes became possible, raising questions about what might finally emerge. While international research stations increased surveillance and logistical control, suggesting that both environmental shifts and human curiosity were converging to challenge decades of secrecy. And yet, despite technological advancement, global awareness, and a century of study, Antarctica retained its ultimate paradox. Fully visible from space yet shrouded in mystery, a place where ice, history, and speculation intertwine, leaving humanity with an enduring question. How much of the truth lies buried beneath the frozen surface? And what will be revealed when the final veil is lifted? Because the continent's story, like the ice itself, is constantly shifting. And only those who venture close enough may witness the fragile boundary between known reality and the hidden frontier that still waits beneath the Antarctic ice. A world of secrets preserved for those who dare to seek them.